the last thing we're going to be examining is colonial societies in the Americas. So we'll look at North and South America, and then we'll look at religion and also pirates. Ah, we cannot forget about pirates. They're not talked about in your book either. So the colonial societies of North and South America were extremely different. The small percentage of Spanish and Portuguese female migrants led to lots of intermarriage and intermingling between European and indigenous people. The result was a growing mixed population, which we'll take a look at in detail in a second. The first example of this is Malinche. If you remember from early in the PowerPoint, she had children and with Cortez and also helped him to take over the Aztec Empire. Her Spanish name is Donna Marina. And like I said, she is still a celebrated and also reviled figure in Mexican history. European descendants dominated the society. Creoles were people of pure European status. So we're not talking like Creole food in Louisiana, although it's related. But this Creole status gave people an elevated status. Basically, how much European you had in you determined your status, and we'll see that in just a second. Also, besides status being based on mixture, urban elites were incredibly powerful. You either had a political or an economic job that gave you a lot of power in society, and people became incredibly wealthy. In North America, however, because of a much higher percentage of female migrants, especially amongst English colonists, there was much less mixing, and this reduced intermarriage. So the English made every attempt to eliminate contact between different groups. And the French lay somewhat in between. A Métis, many fur traders, first of all, intermarried with the indigenous population. And there was actually a lot of respect between the French and the indigenous population because, of course, the indigenous people were the ones who were showing the French where they could find these exceptional furs. So intermarriages between French and indigenous people led to a group of people called the Métis rising up. And in French colonies, as in English colonies, status was much more based on wealth. So in in North America, we can see this. A good example of this is Thomas Jefferson's children. Thomas Jefferson's children that he had with his slave Sally Hemings were considered to be African American. They were considered to be slaves, whereas in the Latin American or South American societies, those people would have an entirely different social group. It would actually raise their social status. So here we see a family in Latin America with a European father, a indigenous mother, and a mixed child. And then here we see a typical European family in North America. Here is the colonial class system a little bit more broken down. As you can see on top, you had the Peninsulares, or people from the Iberian Peninsula. Underneath are the Creoles. These are European descendants who were born in the Americas. Then you have the Mestizos, who were a mixture of indigenous and Europe. Mulattoes were a mixture between Africans, not all of whom were slaves, some of whom came over as indentured servants, and Europeans. And underneath you had indigenous and black slaves. Now, sometimes these two groups mixed as well. And this chart, there were much more lines in between here. I mean, this just made an incredibly complex social system. And especially these groups are going to be incredibly important in period 5 with our revolutions. Looking at religions in the Americas, there's a bunch of different mixes between indigenous religions and Christianity. The two that are mentioned in your key concept packet are the saint cults. For example, the Virgin Guadalupe. Um, this cult started when a Aztec descendant saw a woman and presumed that she was the Virgin Mary at a previous temple site. And this resulted in a temple. It is now the most popular Catholic church, or the most visited Catholic church in the Americas. This type of mixture of religions also has led to a little bit more superstitions and also led to a little bit more environmental factors as well. And here we see the Virgin Guadalupe. It's the most common image in the Americas, like I said. Another example of this mixture of traditions is the Day of the Dead, which occurs around Halloween and is a reverence for the ancestors of the indigenous people. So people visit the graves of their ancestors and leave flowers and beautiful drawings and things like that. Another example of mixing of religions is Vodun or Voodoo. And this is a mixture between African traditions and then Christian traditions. So there's this element of Christianity, but there's also this mystical or magical element with people like medicine men. And I think the most famous part of this that you might know is zombies. Zombies come from the voodoo tradition, as well as voodoo dolls. So those may be two things you associate with it. And this religion is not covered in your book. Another thing that's not covered in your book, and the thing that we'll go over last, are the challenges to authority, mainly in pirates. Piracy in the Caribbean went through its heyday from the 1550s to about the 1830s. The pirates even established port cities in the Mediterranean. These were cities like Nassau in the Bahamas and Port Royal in Jamaica. Why would you want to become a pirate besides the sweet headgear and speaking voice? Well, a pirate ship offered more equality and opportunity for sailors. Being a sailor for the British East India Company was pretty rough. It was not very lucrative, and it was like your lowest option. So pirate ships, when you split up your booty equally. There were also people who escaped slavery who would join piracy, and this led to pirate ships being called multi-ethnic ships or motley crews, which is where the band gets its name, right? This ragtag group of rebels, motley crews, multi-ethnic crews. Sometimes piracy was even sponsored by states, kind of like state-sponsored terrorism. And mainly this was economic terrorism. Pirates were stealing silver, sugar, Eastern goods from China. They would interrupt the galleon ships. And they were also looking for raw materials. Here we have a pirate ship invading land and destroying a port. And here we have a pirate flag. This is the flag of Calico Jack. And calico, remember, was a fabric from India. So in the end, these competitions that we learned about in chapter 24 were also manifesting themselves in the Americas. And not everything was as lawful or as neat and orderly as it seemed. The last thing I'd like to leave you with is that Portugal and Spain, although they made immense amounts of profits at this time, eventually lost profits because they did not invest in infrastructure and instead it used resource extraction and not resource creation. So that's a big difference that I'd like to leave you with as well from the North and South American colonies. That's the end of our flipped classrooms for chapter 25. Thank you for listening, and please fill out the listening check.